Alrighty, we can go ahead and get things started. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Jillian Cobb. I'm the public programs producer here at the National Nordic Museum. I am delighted to welcome you all to today's virtual talk, The Arctic in Literature, which is a part of exhibit-related programming for Arctic Highways. Today's program, we're going to talk about a bunch of stuff, so I'm going to get really excited. The Arctic is a region that challenges definitions. Despite the picture of a harsh wasteland of ice and snow imagined by many temperate outsiders, it is home to a diverse group of peoples, both Indigenous and settler-colonialists. All of these people, and it turns out plenty of outsiders, tell stories, write poems, sing songs, and create images of the Arctic. But what can these stories really tell us about it? In this talk, we will discuss some of those stories, looking for what they might have in common and how they differ in order to address the question of what literature can tell us about what the Arctic is and perhaps what it isn't. We will have some time for Q&A following this lecture, so please feel free to write down your questions as you think of them in the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. And this session is also being recorded for you all to enjoy later on our YouTube channel. And once I put this up on our YouTube, I will email all participants a link, so you'll get to see it there. Our speaker today is Andy Meyer, who is currently a visiting assistant professor in the Norwegian department at St. Olaf College in Northfield, Minnesota, as he is on leave from the University of Washington. He teaches primarily Norwegian language and courses and literatures of the Norway and Arctic. He has taught Norwegian language for the International Summer School at the University of Oslo. His teaching and research background are in American literature with an emphasis on eco-criticism, poetry, and poetics, literature of the North American West, and more recently, Arctic studies. Much of his work is interested in questions about the relationship between literary imagination and wildness, questions that have drawn him toward the American, Canadian, and Scandinavian North. In 2015 and 2016, he was a Fulbright roving scholar in Norway, where he traveled the length of the country giving workshops and lectures in 61 schools on the mainland and in Svalbard. So with that, I am happy to pass things over to Andy to get our program started for today.
All right. Well, thank you, Jill, for that kind introduction. And thanks everybody for being here, and also to the Nordic Museum for the invitation to share some thoughts with you today about the Arctic and about what it is and what it isn't, as was just mentioned, potentially, and what we can get out of literature that deals with this vast region at the top of the world. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. I'm going to make sure that things are looking good. Let's see here, and then I'll start my slideshow. There we go. Okay, so the title of my talk is The Arctic in Literature, and I have this sort of graphic question mark to go with it, since part of my topic includes the question of what we can and can't see or experience in the Arctic when we read literature by or about that place and the people that live there. Jill mentioned in the introduction that a lot of outsiders have opinions and feelings and make images, etc., about the Arctic. I want to say at the outset that I'm actually one of those outsiders, of course. I'm not from an Arctic place. I'm from Iowa originally, and I've lived for a long time in Seattle, and now I'm back here in Minnesota. But I'll talk in a little bit about where a lot of my interest in the Arctic came from. And I, again, want to be really thoughtful, try to be really thoughtful about how I position myself in relation to some of these texts. I consider myself more of an enthusiast at this point in my career than an expert. So a lot of this talk is really meant to make suggestions about ways that anyone here in this virtual room can approach literature about distant places, and particularly the Arctic. So we'll get into some of those issues more specifically in a little bit. I want to start with a quotation by the Danish Greenlandic sort of anthropologist, I guess is one way to put it, Knud Rasmussen, who a lot of you, I'm guessing, have probably heard of. In his book, The People of the Polar North, he has this little moment that really strikes me because it says a lot about the role of imagination in literature, and not just literature, but in reading more generally. He describes a moment where he was in Greenland. And for those that aren't familiar, real quick, Rasmussen became very well known for in Europe, especially in the United States and Canada, for his big journeys, his sort of anthropological journeys through Greenland and Inuit Canada. And he, was sort of semi-trained as an anthropologist, but he was he had a sort of ethnographic view of the people he encountered. He had Greenlandic ancestry, and so was partly from, he was actually born in Greenland, but lived most of his life in Denmark, and took a lot of notes about his encounters with Inuit peoples, both in Greenland and Canada. So he's a very complicated figure in this sort of topical area. And he's both interesting for positive reasons and also for some of the more problematic reasons that define the colonial and post-colonial moment. But he has this moment in People of the Polar North where he's on a sled journey, a dog sled journey with some Greenlandic guides, and they're visiting some villages, some of them abandoned and some of them still inhabited. And he arrives at one sort of recently abandoned village, and has this to say at one moment. He says, "We walked around examining all these things, which in their silent way spoke to us of the men and women who lived their lonely life up here. A little way from the houses in a circle were some large round stones, shining with stale grease. Here they must have had their meals," suggested one of our Greenlanders. Already our imagination was at work. And I want to start with that quotation because I think it's got some interesting problems in it. One of them being that this, we tend to talk of the imagination as this beautiful thing, and it certainly is, and it's a very powerful thing that the human mind does and has. But also in this context, I hope you can see that it's a little bit troubling, or at least it has the potential to be a little troubling. Already our imagination is at work. Well, his imagination, especially coming largely with a Danish perspective, looking at people that have been colonized, even then, he was doing a lot of this work in the early 1900s. It's not a pure sort of ethically neutral imagination. And yet just by seeing a little glimpse of something, he allows himself to imagine all kinds of possibilities that may or may not hold water, to use a bit of a metaphor. So I want to start with that to get us thinking right at the outset about the different ways that the imagination can be used. So my plan for the talk is to talk a little bit about my background and how and why I've made this Arctic turn, to pun it a little bit, in recent years. I want to talk a little bit about what the Arctic is from a sort of definition standpoint. Where is this place we're talking about? There's a number of different ways to define it. And then lastly, and I think the largest part of the talk will be, I'm just going to run through a few examples of places where the Arctic or some idea or version of the Arctic can be found in literature. And again, as the introduction sort of stated, thinking about maybe the ways that the Arctic itself is very difficult to transmit through literary thinking. So how I got here, what's my background? Why am I talking about this? I mentioned I consider myself an enthusiast more than an expert, since this is a somewhat recent, past seven or 8 years that I've really begun to look at Arctic literature. So to give a little background on that, I got my BA in English, actually, from Luther College in Decorah, Iowa, that many of you probably heard of. If you go upstairs in the Nordic Museum, you can see a little bit about Luther and some of the exhibits there, since it was founded by Norwegian Americans in the 1800s. I studied Norwegian there for several semesters, but I was not a major. My primary topics were music and English. But I want to start there because it's also a sort of one of these places that isn't immune, despite everything, to imagining things for, I don't want to say the wrong purposes, but allowing some poetic inaccuracies to take hold. The mascot of Luther College is the Norse, as you can see in the logo there. And of course, they put the horns on the Viking helmet, which, we all know wasn't a feature of Viking helmets, thanks to Wagner and his operas. So there, we let ourselves do this so quickly, is sort of what I'm getting at there. Nevertheless, I had a great education there. I went to the University of Washington afterwards to get my PhD in English. But I was interested in eco-criticism. I was looking at environment in literature and how environments, both human and natural, are represented in literature and what that can tell us about our values. And I always had Norwegian in the back of my mind. And there's a couple of philosophers in Norway that have been really influential in environmental thought. One of them, Arne Næss, that some of you may be familiar with. And I became interested in some of those thinkers and wanted to approach them in their native language. And so, since Norwegian was already in the background, I convinced my committee that Norwegian should be my other language that I focus on, and they accepted that proposal. So I studied Norwegian in Oslo shortly after I began grad school, and it was always sort of a secondary part of my life. My topic in grad school was wilderness. I was looking at, as a wilderness enthusiast myself, who loved to canoe and hike in the mountains, etc. I was fascinated by this idea that there are these places, these natural places in the world that are that have never been inhabited by people. I slowly realized, ooh, they have, right? People have been living in what we call wilderness for thousands of years before Europeans and then Americans got here. And so I began to be really interested in that concept in a critical way, looking at how some ideas of wilderness erase, especially Indigenous people who have tended a lot of these landscapes for millennia. And my dissertation took up that question in various ways. And that really is where this interest in the Arctic emerged, and I'll say more about that in just a moment. In 2015 and 16, I was very fortunate to become a Fulbright roving scholar in American Studies in Norway. It's a unique Fulbright program among all the Fulbright offerings, where the roving scholar lives in Oslo but visits high schools or middle schools. There's one for middle school as well. All over the country. And so this map shows the 61 different high schools that I visited throughout my time in Norway. And as you can see, many of them were in the Arctic, above the Arctic Circle, including one in Longyearbyen, which is the town in Svalbard at about 78 degrees north latitude. And in that experience, I became particularly fascinated by the Arctic landscape and the natural environment that so many people in Norway anyway lived in. And then I went to Svalbard, as I mentioned, to visit a high school there. And I was struck immediately, having spent a lot of time studying Western literature of the American West, and looking at the relationship between nature and extractive enterprises like mining and oil drilling, etc. I went to Svalbard and I was struck in Longyearbyen that this looked very much like an Old West town. And I saw a lot of the same sort of features that one might see in stereotypical images of the Old West, but in Arctic clothing, right? Here is, this sort of mountainous landscape. This is in the end of February, so there's not a whole lot of daylight. But nevertheless, there's the remainders of these extractive mining enterprises. In this case, coal. Coal was the big industry in Svalbard. And you can see these sort of very much of the same era, right? When the colonial sort of arm was spreading itself over the world, looking for all kinds of resources. And what struck me too is that Svalbard seemed for a moment to be unique because nobody lived there, right? It wasn't a place like the American West or several other places where colonists, settler colonists displaced Indigenous people to get their stuff, right? Or to make it their own. And yet it's very much a part of the same process, right? It's the same way of thinking that somehow this belongs to us and we can go there. So I saw some of these same things echoing as I was walking around the town of Longyearbyen. Here you can see, instead of horses, we have snowmobiles, right, as the way to get around. And the images struck me as just very resonant in that way. So then I began to realize this is really the same thing, right? Or at least it's related. It's in the same family of ideas, that there's a distant place, a new place that somehow the colonial mind thinks it has a right to, and so it acts upon that feeling, and then we get a new kind of story. And in the Svalbard Museum, as I was walking around, there's a wonderful museum there that details some of the history and the people that have been there. I ran across a woman named Vani Volstad, who was a taxi driver in Tromsø in northern Norway in the early 1900s. She was actually the first, as far as I know, she was the first female taxi driver in that industry at the time. And in her adventures taxi driving in Tromsø, she was the chauffeur for a number of the overwinters, the sort of big game hunters that would spend the winters up in Svalbard and then come back at the year's end and sell their wares and then re-equip for the next season. And these are sort of a rough-edged group of people, and she ferried them back and forth from the piers to the hotels, etc. when they came back, and she was fascinated by these stories that they told. And so she became herself the first woman to take part in some of those hunting endeavors, and wrote a memoir about it that I have since become very fascinated by, and I've done some translation work around it, and also written some about it. So you can see here again the same sort of aesthetic as you see in so much of the West, the American West. So that's kind of how I got here. Again, this is relatively new in my career in the past several years. So I'm an enthusiast, and I hope that my enthusiasm and critical enthusiasm, I want to say as well, comes through this talk. So what are we actually talking about when we talk about the Arctic is the sort of second part of my talk here. There are a couple of different ways to define what the Arctic is, or when we say the Arctic region or the circumpolar Arctic, what are we actually looking at? The two sort of technical definitions are either geographical or climatic. If we define the Arctic geographically, we're looking at the Arctic Circle. And for many of you, I'm sure this is very obvious, but just to put it out there, the Arctic Circle is the line of latitude at 66 degrees and 33 minutes north. And it's actually drifting very, very slowly because of the Earth wobbles on its axis. But the wobble, of course, takes something like 13,000 years to go one way, and then 13,000 years back. So it's an extremely slow wobble. But yet that line of latitude moves a certain number of centimeters every year. At this point, it's located pretty neatly at 6633. And that's, of course, the point on the Earth where during the winter, the lowest point, the most southernmost point, I should say, where during the winter, the sun sets on the winter solstice. The sun sets and doesn't come up. And then in the summer solstice, it doesn't quite set. So that's the light. The Arctic Circle has everything to do with light. And that's that place where you get at least one day of polar night and at least one day of midnight sun. Climatically, which is another way to define the Arctic and changes the boundaries a bit, is to use the 10-degree isotherm. And that refers to the place on the Earth where, or the sort of area of the Earth where the average temperature in July does not exceed 10 degrees Celsius, which is, I don't know, 52 or something like that. So relatively cool. And as a result, the plant life that can grow there changes very much. And the colder you get, obviously, the more the plant life changes. But that 10-degree isotherm is what scientists have suggested is the Arctic climate in general. And of course, that is also a relatively shifty sort of definition, especially as the climate changes and pretty rapidly at that. And then there's a third sort of subcategory of identification for the Arctic, and that is by cultural association. There are peoples, for example, that identify with the land, cultural practices, the histories of the traditions of the North that don't necessarily live in any of these specifically sort of technical definitions. And I think that's really important. It can cut both ways, of course. You have, for example, China identifying itself in certain contexts these days as a near Arctic nation because it borders countries that have Arctic footholds of various kinds, and there's a potential economic advantage to some of those things as the climate changes. So lots of factors coming into this. The term Arctic comes from the Greek for bear, and so Arctic. The Greek term arktos means bear, and then arctikos means something like of or near the bear. And it seems like an odd name for the Arctic. You might think polar bears or something like that, but really what the Greeks were talking about was this overlay image, which behind it you can see, hopefully, the Big Dipper there, Ursa Major, the big bear, who helps locate the north. If you move up from the end of that constellation, you'll see Polaris on Ursa Minor, the little bear, and that is your North Star. So the places that were near the bear were to the Greeks in the north when we look at the sky at night. So I think just some interesting little extra information. And so looking at this, just to make graphic these definitions, in this image created by Grid Arendal, sort of informational imaging company in Norway, or organization, I should say. You can see here both the Arctic Circle represented and the gray circle in the middle, and then the purple line around the outer edge is the 10-degree isotherm as of 2010. And on top of that, you have temperature gradations here in the blue and the tan colors and white as well, which gives you this other piece of information, and that is that the 10-degree isotherm is one thing when you look at it at the global scale, but it also has to do with elevation. So some of these places will be exceptions. They'll be very cold because they're very high, even if they're significantly south of that isotherm. So there's, again, a complicated set of factors that come into defining a place like the Arctic. But again, the key is, where does light and temperature affect overall, on average, what grows and what the landscape actually looks like. And I will warn you that there is a thunderstorm, beautiful, gentle thunderstorm happening here in Northfield, Minnesota right now. So if you hear thunder in the background, don't be alarmed. The other thing then, thinking about light in particular, Barry Lopez wrote a book in the 90s called Arctic Dreams. He spent a long time up in Canada studying and working, and he wrote a book about his time there. He was studying the Northwest Passage and the sort of complicated cultural and social history of the explorers that were looking for the Northwest Passage and the various indigenous groups that they encountered. And he wrote this very interesting sort of thought in his text Arctic Dreams. He says the idea that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west simply does not apply in the Arctic. The thought that a day consists of a morning and a forenoon and an afternoon and an evening is a convention, one that is so embedded in us we hardly think about it. A convention of our literature and arts. And the pattern is not the same here, being in the Arctic, right? And that struck me, I remember, as a younger reader, that to think about all those things you take for granted, and they change when you're on different places in the earth. We can also see, as I mentioned, this idea of wilderness and the Arctic, and so many people think immediately of a place devoid of people, of a barren frozen wasteland, and maybe a polar bear or a seal. Unfortunately, too many people also think there are penguins in the Arctic based on popular imagery, right? But there are no penguins in the Arctic. They're an Antarctic creature. And yet these images persist. And then you also have to realize that there are numerous indigenous peoples that inhabit Arctic places. And this map, again, by Grid Arendal, shows how diverse and widespread indigenous peoples are. So the Arctic is a very human place, even as it has this sort of temperate outsider reputation as something else. And there are multiple language groups and tribal identifications, etc., that make it quite a rich human place. And it's also human in the colonial sense. You can see in this map again a similar infographic. This one shows population as well as industry. And it does so in quite an interesting way. I think you can see the green circles scattered throughout the map are population. They represent population. So the larger the circle, the more people are there. And then the tiny green dots are very small villages and hamlets, fewer than 20,000 and often much less than that. And you can see at a glance that the vast majority of population concentration is in the Nordic, I should say, the Nordic and sort of northwestern Siberian regions, where you have Murmansk, and then all the Norwegian cities make quite a big Arctic population. Surrounded, of course, also by the red dots, or the red squares rather, which represent oil extraction fields. And so you can see that there's quite a bit of industrial activity that sort of defines big parts of the Arctic as well. And the irony certainly is not lost on most of us, insofar as the Arctic is also sort of famous in these days for being the epicenter of climate change. So lots to sort of think about there as well. Again, the concentrations in population are in Western Siberia, the Kola Peninsula, and the Nordic region, including Iceland as well, since Reykjavik is a city, but it is not technically in the Arctic as far as the Arctic Circle is concerned, but much of Iceland has a sort of that Arctic climate. And just at the very top of Iceland, the Arctic Circle runs. So it's often affiliated with some of these same contexts. And also the Arctic is vastly protected from a conservation standpoint. There are huge swaths of land area that are protected. Sea is a different question. I should say, going back one step to this map, some of the lines you see across the Arctic there are either existing or proposed or sort of future shipping lanes. The Northern Sea Route that Russia manages is a big one, the Northwest Passage. That was the obsession of many explorers in the late 1800s from Europe, are represented there. And then the one that cuts right across the middle is a future central Arctic shipping route that presumes that the sea ice is going to melt. So you can see there's a darkness to that map as well. And so conservation is a big deal in the Arctic. And there's an International Union for the Conservation of Nature, a sort of intergovernmental organization that attempts to protect a lot of it. But again, these spaces inhabit this tenuous position between places that have a very, very long human history and places that we can call in some sense natural. So there's just lots of complex tensions to be considered when we talk about conserving nature in these places. So what of all this stuff can we actually find in literature? And in some cases very little, and in some cases a lot. Again, I'm not an expert here, but I do have a lot of enthusiasm, and I've at least been exposed to a range of different texts and ideas that I think are worth sharing and worth dipping into, just to get a sense for yourself of what you see or what the Arctic is to you, and how it's represented in literature might reinforce or challenge some of those thoughts. One thing, what was I just going to say? I lost my train of thought. In any case, we'll just get into the examples and we'll run from there. I want to start with a short poem by a Norwegian poet that sort of gets at some of the problems with people like me getting into Arctic literature. So I want to be mindful of that issue. We tend to think of all of us, no matter who we are, in some senses, I think, tend to think of ourselves and what we know as the center, right? We're the center of what we know. Our civilizations that we come from are the center of what we understand the world to be, and people and things from outside of it tend to be the periphery, right? And yet we're all part of this global world together. So Rolf Jacobsen wrote this poem called North, that goes something like this. It's sort of a rough translation that I put together. He says it's a beautiful poem that many people, wilderness enthusiasts, right, will often appeal to and say, oh, what a beautiful way to think. And it goes like this: look oftener to the north. Go into the wind, you'll get ruddier cheeks. Find the impassable path, keep to it. It is shorter. North is best. Winter's sky of flame, the sun miracle of summer nights. Go into the wind. Scale mountains, look to the north, oftener. It is long, this land. The most of it is north. And I first ran into that poem, and I still appreciate it very much, but it does raise a question. If we think of Norway indeed as a long country, a lot of which is quote unquote north, we imagine someone in Oslo, for example, or in the south, looking up and seeing the north. Wow, so much north there is. But what the poem doesn't really take into consideration very well is that there are people in the north looking, and to them, perhaps, there's a lot of south to the Norwegian country. And that inverted perspective, from the perspective of Jacobsen anyway, from the perspective of the poet, is sort of missing from this poem and from a lot of images that are made of northern people. And so in the examples that I'm going to share, I'm going to try to mix up to a fair degree people from the outside and people from the north itself, and people from the north and people from the south, who might say, and sort of look at the different ways that the north is conceived of in those different texts. And the basic premise is that when a writer writes, they ask a limited but unknown group of readers to think about something. It's kind of as simple as that, right? They put an image, an event, a story, a question, a commitment, an idea, a possibility, something of some kind into a conversation that circulates through that bunch of readers. And that conversation may be happening internally in the mind, right? But nevertheless, it's circulating among readers. And an eco-critic like me might ask the question, how does the place where a work of literature originates enter into that circulation of thoughts and reactions? But the second problem is, what exactly constitutes a place? I can write a story about a place never having been there, right? I can imagine that something happens in that place. What does that mean, right? Well, so place could be even the place a writer is from as much as the place being represented in the text. So there's lots of variables to consider there as well. So let's start with Sapmi. I'm assuming that most people attending this talk are familiar with that term. Sapmi is the Sami name for the Sami homelands, which encompass a multinational space that stretches across the northern half, more or less, of all of the Nordic countries, minus Iceland, minus Denmark, I should say too. So Norway, Sweden, and Finland, and then over far to the other side of the Kola Peninsula in Russia. So it's a large area that is the traditional homelands of the Sami people. Perhaps the most famous, it's probably not too controversial to claim, Sami writer is Nils Aslak Valkeapää, who was instrumental in the 70s, 80s, and 90s in resuscitating Sami cultural production practices, the yoik, the song form, the yoik, as well as Sami writing and dress and all kinds of cultural productions that were very explicitly suppressed during about a 150-year period in Norway. In Norway, anyway, I'm most familiar with the Norwegian context. The period which we call Norwegianization, or fornorskningspolitikk is the Norwegian term, where the official government policy mirrored that of many places in the United States, where it was illegal to practice anything that could be perceived as traditionally Sami. And so boarding schools were a big part of that. Forced assimilation was essentially the project. And then in the later part of the 20th century, people like Valkeapää were active and activist in resuscitating some of those traditions. And Valkeapää wrote a long sort of free verse poetic text that also is a long extended musical performance that we know today in the United States as The Son, My Father. It was translated to in a single edition, Norwegian and Swedish and Sami. And the title of that text was Solen min far, which is the same thing, The Son, My Father. And then the original Sami text, and I apologize for my pronunciation, but Beaivi Ahjajan was the original title. And that text was made a big splash and was given the Nordic Council Literature Prize in 1991, which put Sami art and Sami literature on the global map in some ways. And it is a very powerful text, but it has some interesting features, one of which is that the Sami text, the cover of which here you can see at the right, is very different from the text translated for Scandinavian and English readers, among others. And partly, there's a number of features there. Valkeapää himself insisted that parts of the text could not be translated, right? They were not for readers outside of the Sami language community. And so much of the text was not translated and could not be translated, which I find very powerful. And on top of that, the original text in North Sami was, just for reference, something like this thing. It's about 450 pages. And the texts that are translated run to about 150 or so. So they're much thinner volumes, and in part because the original text included something like 360 archival images, photographs, mostly taken by Southerners, right, who documented Sami people in the early days, and for purposes that we reject today as ethnocentrist and even racist. And so, but nevertheless, Valkeapää included these images in his original text, meant for the appropriate audience to take them and view them critically. Because there's knowledge that someone like me, even if I were to learn North Sami to such a degree that I could read it fluidly, there's things I can't know and things I shouldn't know as an outsider. And I think that's a very powerful thought. And yet I can access other versions of this text and I can see its power. So I'm just going to show you a couple images of the text for those that aren't familiar. I'm sure many of you have encountered this text in some or another way. It's a free verse poem that I find very, very compelling in its translated forms. This is the English translation, and you can see that there are words, but there are also sounds, and then there's also a very graphic, a very visual element to the text, and it proceeds this way in many different formulations. It at one point images a reindeer herd moving across several pages, but in text and using textual figures as the material. So there's a lot of power in it, and in some ways it's very clear and very simple, and you get these images of the Arctic that I find really compelling, especially poem number 58. It's very short, but to me it just says so much when I, as an outsider, think about standing in an Arctic place, the wind. That's one thing that I get out of it. And what do I do with it is the next question. And there's a lot there. So I'll let you take a moment to look at those texts. This is just, again, a very tiny piece of a very long, expansive text. So that's one example. Another, and I want to make sure I move through my text so that I don't get too far behind here. Another is a relatively recent text called The Pastor by the Northern Norwegian author. She's a non-Sami and non-Indigenous writer from Norway, grew up in Tana, the Tana area in Northern Norway. She wrote a book in 2012 called Presten, which was finally translated in 2021, just a couple years ago as The Pastor. And this is a story of, Ørstavik writes very dark, contemplative stories where she really explores her characters' motivations, and not always in flattering ways. And The Pastor certainly fits that pattern. This book is about a woman who is a pastor. She's a Norwegian woman who moves to Germany to take her theology degree and become a pastor. And then has a relationship there that is, it sort of falls apart, and she's not sure why. And then the other half of that relationship takes her own life. And so this pastor, newly ordained pastor with this heavy history, takes a position as a pastor in a Northern Norwegian church, and moves up to Northern Norway by herself to try to make a life as a pastor. But she's haunted by her own inability to say things, her own inability to articulate things. On top of that all, which makes it a really interestingly Arctic text, is that this character, in her education, essentially her dissertation, became very interested in the Kautokeino Rebellion of 1852, which is the only significantly bloody conflict between Norwegian and Sami people, despite the sort of horrors of oppression that the Norwegians inflicted on the Sami. This rebellion resulted in a handful of deaths and burnt down a couple of commercial buildings in Kautokeino in 1852. It was sort of the event that set off from the Norwegian side this 150 or so years of direct political oppression. And so this character in the book is very obsessed almost with this text, and she's obsessed with the fact that there's this gap in the source material. We have the letters exchanged between the pastor involved and the bishop and the merchants, but we don't have a good, rich written record of what the rebellers, or the rebels, I should say, thought and what their motives were. The event was, of course, made into a famous film that many of you are probably familiar with, called the Kautokeino Rebellion, or Kautokeino Opprøret in Norwegian. And so there's a lot of different ways to tell this story as well. But I highlighted this bit as she's describing her interest in this topic. She says, "I felt as if it concerned me directly." And I think that's, in my reading of Ørstavik, a sort of critical moment in this pastor's life. She is trying to be very open-hearted, and yet she can't escape this idea that she has to be involved as a representative of a settler colonial attitude. And that's a complicated and somewhat problematic position. What also comes through this text are some really interesting descriptions of landscape. She's her internal mind, her internal state is as intense as her external one, as she's observing the northern Norwegian landscape with very few trees, or at least certainly not high ones or tall ones like we're used to in the Northwest. But there's just an openness, and she, in swirling through her thoughts and her sort of feelings of inadequacy, et cetera, she sees the landscape sort of mirroring the emptiness she feels. And it doesn't have to be seen that way, right? But in her mental state, that's what she sees. And so I won't take all the time to read through these lines, but you can at least glance through them as I'm talking and see what kind of ideas or feelings come through here. And I want to bring up another text. So moving a little bit further south into northern Norway, Edgar Allan Poe actually wrote a text, an Arctic text called Descent into the Maelstrom in 1841, a short story where it's a story within a story, where an old man tells the narrator of this event where he and his shipmates were caught in a great Charybdis-like cyclone, or whirlpool rather, and their boat was sucked down, and he managed to cling to a barrel and survive. And it's not it's a weirdly, the first time I read it, I thought it was kind of boring until I realized, oh, there's something else happening. This is just a little graphical depiction of where that whirlpool was said to exist. And there is a maelstrom there, but a maelstrom is not this thing, right? A maelstrom is not this swirling, devouring whirlpool that so many people think. Rather, it's where the tide, it's a shallow shelf or a saddle underneath the water there, that when the tide waters come in and out, it creates a sort of churning water that can be dangerous to boats, but not in the sense that they get sucked down into a vortex. Interestingly, of course, Poe never visited Norway to make this story. So what he's gotten is through hearsay, namely sources like this. Some of you may have seen this map before. It's called Carta Marina, created by the Swedish cleric named Olaus Magnus in 1539. He created this map while he was in Rome, in fact, but he put it together by hearsay. He, of course, also never visited most of the places represented on this map, and yet it became a highly influential piece. And you can see where a lot of despite his commitment to the Christian church, he was very interested in the stories he heard in his research of supernatural forces and powers, and depicted various peoples drawing on supernatural powers that created shipwrecks, et cetera, et cetera. But one key piece of this map is right here in this white square. And if you zoom in on it, you can see the island of Lofot, one called Vast or Vost, and one called Rust or Rost, which is probably Röst, their actual island, as well as, of course, Lofoten, the archipelago, and Vast might be something like Varøy, which is where that between Varøy and the main and Moskenesøy, these two islands, is where that maelstrom exists. And yet here, of course, Magnus represents it as that sort of swirling vortex that swallows ships, just like Charybdis did in Greek mythology. And you can see that he labels it Charybdis, in fact, on his map. And so Poe is drawing on all these sort of sources to create an image of an Arctic place that he never had been. And for the sake of time, I'm going to move quickly through this. The narration is kind of boring, as I mentioned, to me anyway, but it becomes interesting when you look at how untrustworthy this narrator is, which is, you can map on then to the larger scale and look at Poe's sources and all that. And yet Poe does a wonderful job of, as he often does, of depicting the sort of mystery. The man it's a story within a story, as I mentioned. The man takes the old man takes the narrator up to the top of this mountain in Lofoten to overlook where this happened, this maelstrom, and he insists he has to take him here to tell the story because you'll see it with your own eyes, and only then can you believe. And yet everything in this story is about not trusting what you see. He begins and says, I suppose you think me a very old man, but I am not. I was made to look old by this event, right? And so it sort of undercuts itself in this wonderful way. And so you can't quite trust the version of anything that you're getting, since he's at once asking you to believe your eyes and don't believe your eyes, right? So I think that's sort of an interesting depiction of the Arctic. And it's a very easy text to get a hold of, so I certainly recommend looking it up. We also have a similar kind of intensity, a sort of mythic invention of the Arctic in people as sort of reliable, quote unquote, as Fridtjof Nansen, who in his account of his From expedition, where he proved to the scientific community that in fact the Arctic Ocean was sea ice and not a mystical continent, he wrote in Farthest North a couple of things that strike me. One is where he says, "I have just two things to say. The first is that this book has become too personally colored to be considered a travel narrative in the usual sense, but my hope is that the narrative will nevertheless shine through this objective, and that there, from the shifting atmospheres, an image of nature and the life and that great icy loneliness will emerge." This is sort of the foreword to his text. And so he admits that there's poetic license taken to the scientific text, and yet through that poetic depiction of the Arctic Ocean, we're supposed to get some kind of sense of reality. But he opens that text with a very over-the-top sort of mythical vision of the Nordic or sort of Norse origins of the Arctic Sea, and sort of moves it into this kind of nationalistic, we Norwegians were bound to be here, right? Because of our sort of supernatural origins in the Norse gods. And so, this is something that would never make its way into a semi-scientific text in our day and age. But I think it says a lot. And again, for the sake of time, I won't analyze this text, but also very easy to get a hold of. And I certainly encourage you to wrestle with these first pages of the From expedition. For those that aren't familiar, this is the route that they took. The orange line is the route of the ship. And then partway through, Nansen and his compatriot Hjalmar Johansen set off on skis and dog sleds and over the sea ice and tried to make it to the North Pole. They didn't quite get there, but they got pretty close. A couple images of that expedition for those that aren't familiar. It also has inspired contemporary exhibition, the Mosaic expedition, that was the largest scientific expedition to the Arctic ever, was inspired directly by Fram's methods, ultimately, of getting a ship intentionally frozen in the ice in order to see what happens. And so, much more modern ship with much more modern tools, but you can see certainly the icy loneliness is real, right? But to untie it from the language is quite a task. I want to mention very quickly that he also dedicated the book From to his wife, Eva Sars Nansen, who goes nameless in the book, but who in her own right was a very important figure, especially she was a an excellent skier, and was instrumental in getting women skiing to be on equal footing with men skiing at the time. But he nevertheless doesn't name, she named the ship apparently, according to the dedication, but he doesn't name her, which I think is a little frustrating. And there's also this wordplay that you get in the Norwegian version that doesn't come through the English. From, the Norwegian name of the ship, means forward, but she sat bravely back. I think that's sort of a key piece of his sort of attitude, right? That makes you question, like, what version of anything am I getting from him? Here's a couple examples from Svalbard as well. Again, for the sake of time, I'm going to hop over them relatively quickly, but I'm going to include a link to a short bibliography that I'll share in the chat when I get to the end here, so that if you want to check out any of these texts, I will be happy to send you their way. The Volstad text is a little hard to find. There's not a published translation or an official published translation of it just yet, but eventually that may come through. I want to mention also Greenland has a number of emerging writers that are very powerful. One of them being Jesse Kleeman, who visited the University of Washington. Some of you may have been there at the Burke Museum. We hosted a symposium last spring, and she was among the 4 Arctic voices that we invited to take part in our panel. She wrote a book in 2021 that was nominated for the Nordic Council Literature Prize in 2022. That is a wonderful text called Arcticos Doloros, which of course means the pain, right? The painful Arctic. And she's also a performance artist, so worth looking up to see some of her performance works. She's very fascinating and powerful figure, with living in Denmark, but was born and raised in Greenland. And this text is sort of wonderful. It's a trilingual text, and that's not a new thing, but to put it in this Arctic context makes it extremely powerful to me. It's written, again, Danish mixed in with North Greenlandic and English from time to time. And so it's a strange text for a reader that doesn't speak any one of the three languages. I don't speak Greenlandic, nor do I read it, but I can make my way through Danish because I know Norwegian. And so for someone like me, I find it really fascinating to read this text and wonder constantly which words are being sort of shown in three different languages, or which phrases, what language is sort of being translated and what is not, right? I see a page like this where there are English words, there are Danish words, and I see that the Danish words are not the same as the English words, and that tells me that the Greenlandic words are probably not going to be the same as either two, or maybe they are. And that mystery, I think, is very important. That some of this text is not for me, and yet some of it is, and the parts that are make me ask questions about my position and what I have a right to, which turns out to be very little most of the time. But I find that to be a meaningful realization and a meaningful experience. So again, I highly encourage you to look this book up. It's not widely available in the United States, but I got it from Arena, the Danish publisher, and they just sent it to me. It was relatively easy to order. So you can see there's lots of wonderful text in Greenlandic. I do know enough to know that Halunat at the very top means white person, right, or non-Greenlandic person. So there's little bits of information that you can get that just enrich the language. And of course, the question I ask, like I say, is what do these languages know that I and the other languages don't, right? And that unknowing gives the text a kind of life that I think is very important. The last example, I have two videos that I'm going to show, but I see that we're running short on time. So I'm going to stop short of showing you those clips, but I will note them. For those of you that haven't seen Borgen, it's essentially the West Wing of Denmark. It's a 4-season TV show created by a Danish radio, Dansk Radio, the Danish TV station, and shown on Netflix. And it's available there if you're interested to watch it. It's a wonderful show in its own right. And then they did a 4th season that focused on an alternate reality where alternate present day, where oil has been discovered in Greenland, which throws the colonial relationship between Denmark and Greenland into disarray. Figuring out what does that mean for the potential of Greenlandic independence, and for Denmark's seat at the Arctic Council, and for their sort of power position that they get out of having some colonial power over Greenland. And it kind of turns some of the questions on its head in really interesting ways. So often we think, Greenland is talked about as though it needs Danish support in order to continue, right? In order to hold its own in this big wide world with big sort of massive state powers, Russia, the United States, China. How will tiny little Greenland compete if it's thrown into that mess on its own without the support of Denmark and by extension Europe? But this show does a really interesting job, if you read it one way anyway, of turning that question on its head. Is it maybe that Denmark needs Greenland more than Greenland needs Denmark, especially if the reality of independence were to materialize? It's also worth noting that just recently, within the last number of months, Greenland has unveiled its first draft of a potential constitution. It can't legally at this point do anything about that because that would be seen by Denmark as a breach of their agreement. But it is allowed to write and draft a constitution should that time ever come. So there are interesting steps being taken, but it is, of course, a complicated situation that I'm certainly not an authority to say much more about, but worth looking into. Anyway, episode 4 are these videos that I was going to show, but again, I'll skip those for the sake of time. To end with a couple of films that I recommend that some of you have probably seen since they've become relatively popular. One is Atanarjuat, the Fast Runner, the first major film put out by Zacharias Kunuk, the Inuit film director. It's the first film to be written, directed, and acted in Inuktitut, and was very successful in 2002 when it came out, and it sort of retells, using modern film techniques, an ancient story from the Igloolik area in Nunavut. But the film that I'm particularly interested in is his other film. He's got several, but this film, The Journals of Knud Rasmussen, which, just like Borgen, from the Danish perspective, sort of flips the script. The Journals of Knud Rasmussen flips the narrative that most Europeans and Americans know of Knud Rasmussen going into Inuit Canada and encountering people and observing them, et cetera, et cetera. This film does a beautiful and sort of tragic rendition of the effects that encounter had, but told from the perspective of Inuit. The Inuit people that experienced it. So it's a really beautifully done film, and done in a way that is not the easy, fast, quick, thriller style adventure story that we're used to. It has, in the West anyway, the Hollywood style. It has a depth to it that I think is absolutely worth experiencing. So I'll finish with those recommendations and leave you with these questions about the Arctic in literature. So if you're looking for the Arctic in literature, I recommend asking a few questions. Number one, what Arctic is being represented? What are we talking about when we're talking about the Arctic? When we say the circumpolar Arctic, it's easy to think of that as one place, but it's many places that have a lot to do with each other climatically and otherwise. But also are unique and very different from one another culturally and history and in history. The second question is, whose Arctic? Whose Arctic is being represented and for whom? Those questions become really, really powerful when we actually start to look into the text and flip the perspective, like I did with that first image. So much of this country is north. Well, for who, right? And then, of course, to what end is the Arctic being represented in this way? So I'm going to put this link to bibliography in the chat in just a moment, and I'll take that opportunity just to say thank you once again for inviting me to give this talk, and I hope you got something out of it. So thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Andy, for being here. This was such a great talk. I know I wrote down a ton of notes, and I'm excited to look into some of this literature a little bit more. I've learned a lot today. I hope everyone in the audience has learned a lot today, and you get to take this moving forward with your day, and you get some new reading material out of it. It is just about 12 o'clock, so sadly we won't have any time for any Q&A today. That's okay. It was a great conversation, a great presentation. So thank you for everyone for being here today. Thank you so much, Andy, for giving this talk. It was so wonderful. I learned a lot. So everyone.
One quick question, if I can interrupt. I don't know if anyone can see the link I posted. In my thing, it says to host and panelists, which I don't think includes the attendees.
Let's see here. I will copy it to everyone.
Make sure it's out there.
You can get that. Okay.
There we go. All right. Super. Thank you.
All right. Of course. Yeah, just sent to everyone that Dropbox link from Andy. Everyone should be able to see it now. But thank you all for being here today, and we hope to see you at the museum soon.
Right. Thank you all for coming, everyone.
Bye, everybody.